Invasion Audiobook, Part 23. Having had returned safely, as the sun came up, the remaining 12 survivors of the original group of 30 men, including Jacob, Tony, and the overall group leader George, made it back to their makeshift campsite of earthworks and bunkers. They managed to grab about 3 hours of sleep before George had been awakened by a messenger coming from another area riding upon a dirt bike, who themselves were a scout belonging to another group, and discovered by scouts of George's overall larger armed group. Interestingly enough, the messenger had come to inform George, among many other groups in the outlying areas around Ann Arbor, that the PAP was currently, by and large, deployed currently east of Ann Arbor, a fact that now made the recent events of the early morning make much more sense as to why there had been such little in regards to enemy activity during the supply run / recon and force operation earlier. Insofar as the messenger was concerned, there was more to the message. Other Americans belonging to other local armed groups in the region, having had discovered and worked to spread the news of the current tactical situation, were attempting to coordinate a massive operation involving any potential other American groups they feasibly could find throughout the local Ann Arbor area by combing the forests and woods and underground areas beneath the city, as they had wanted to conduct an operation akin to the Tet-Offensive during the Vietnam War, whereby they'd rise up in various areas in and around Ann Arbor to hit the enemy fast and hard, while the People's Armed Police's attention was diverted elsewhere largely, allowing for there to be the opportunity to not only do massive damage, but to also allow for all participating armed American groups to fully utilize the opportunity to arm themselves with captured enemy supplies and gear, including even ancillary items like MREs and bottled water, and even perhaps fuel that could be taken from such an operation as well, thereby setting themselves up for future operations in the local area. Due to the fact that there would be little to no time to spread the news back and forth between all of the conceivable groups in the area, there were already pre-made, pre-packaged plans ready to go that involved a preset time to partake in such an operation, timing it all so as not to give the enemy the chance to return their PAP elements back throughout the rest of the Ann Arbor area, which would largely hinder or outright crush whatever possible successes that could be had from such an operation. All things considered, the operation was to commence at about 12 noon in merely an hour and a half from the current time of George's armed group receiving the message. The scout, upon spreading the message, hurriedly left to look for any other possible armed American groups in the nearby vicinity upon having left George's group. George's own scouts, having earlier been sent out, having had found the messenger scout from the other group sent to relay the intel and plans, then proceeded to inform George on their findings of discoveries while earlier scouting the nearby area for targets of opportunity. There had been a farm in the area to the southwest of their current position, whereby they discovered a KPA combat outpost with some roughly a company element or possibly smaller of North Korean troops. However, they could not get in closer to find out for sure the relative size or exact composition of such. Also, they'd found another additional enemy-held area directly south near where they'd originally come from when the barrage had come in on day 2, which had wiped out their original first campsite. There were KPA checkpoints upon the road they'd crossed, where they'd earlier passed over, only to then run into Jacob and the other refugees and their guardsmen protectors, then currently under PAP assault on day number 2. This was miles to the south. Though the combat outpost would be closer, however, it had then been decided to split up the men under George's overall command and to hit both areas instead of one or the other, as it was thought that there could be a higher chance of success in case one option failed to work out, as the checkpoints could be easier to hit than might be the combat outpost. However, it was a very tough call to make, because the combat outpost might have been the better choice to deploy all assets, resources, and forces available against, as it might be a greater win, having obviously more chances thereby of obtaining badly needed resources from it. Not that the fuel and sundry items seized earlier, combined with a small quantity of more enemy weapons, wasn't a decent score, but by far many more resources would be necessary to ensure adequate odds of survival down the road in the medium to long term. The necessity for many missions seeking the acquisition of various resources from around the locality would be an ongoing process, to be certain, but this was definitely the most opportune chance to knock out a massive score in one go at it, so to speak. George unceremoniously called everyone around, by now in excess of 150 men, since the turn of day number 3, including the survivors picked up from Jacob's group. With little fanfare, the plan of the Tet-Offensive style operation was announced to the men now all currently present. George then began to announce the role his armed group would play in the overall upcoming sporadically planned operation, as this would be the closest thing, realistically speaking, and even available to a sort of coordinated effort that the armed groups within this region could feasibly pull off by this point on such short notice. It was agreed to split up the forces into two groups, one with 100 men to assault the combat outpost, and 50 men for the checkpoints on the road to the direct south of the camp. As the checkpoints would have by far much less in terms of forces present, according to the scouts who'd been earlier out and about on their rounds. The men were to take whatever all-terrain vehicles were available to the group, with those headed south given more all-terrain vehicles than the group headed to the southwest, mostly because the distances were more to cover to arrive to assault the checkpoints in good timing in order to make it there by noon. They'd need to hurry up and set out ASAP, literally once George finished briefing the men and delegated command to the southernmost group of 50 men to Tony, while he would lead the larger group of 100 men headed to assault the combat outpost. Tony would be left to his own discretion as to how to formulate his own specific assault plan, and set out with two of the scouts who'd found the checkpoint originally among his 50-man group, so as to have accurate intel on the layouts, so as for him to thus be able to formulate his attack plans on the spot upon arriving. As for the group headed to assault the combat outpost, the scouts who found it originally were to travel among that group in like fashion. Jacob found himself going not with Tony, but with George to assault the combat outpost. Due to the small window of time left available and lack of rapid communications, this opportunity for such an operation would be a rarity, as the full-on invasion phase wasn't even quite yet all the way over, although within this region, and many throughout the land, the war was largely now in the occupation phase, insofar as the tempo of enemy operations was concerned, as most of the invasion itself in the full-on assault phases of it were largely now relegated to the clearance of pockets that had now developed throughout the soon-to-be fully vanquished nation, while still leaving the now massively subdued and thus temporarily pacified areas of the nation now beneath a more occupation operational form of existence, whereby the forces weren't as much in a full-bore assaulting phase as they were now in a more patrolling and policing type of tempo of operations overall. However, so it was, for the time being, albeit without the partisan forces fully rising up, who'd been in hiding whilst currently biding their time for the past several days. This was to be the official beginning of such overall partisan operations within the Ann Arbor area, as the war here had been officially won by the foreign forces of the Sino-Russian coalition. On paper, there were no remaining American Armed Forces elements remaining within the AO of the Ann Arbor region, in the organized sense at least, minus perhaps very minuscule, tiny remaining bands of roving guardsmen who were now in hiding currently. At least until now, on day 3, as many armed American groups currently in hiding within the local area were all about to emerge to do their part in this large but extremely ad hoc and poorly coordinated and planned operation, insofar as any kind of detailed planning was concerned at least. However, despite the fact that this was largely the case, It was definitely drastically better than nothing whatsoever at all, and was indeed much like the Tet-Offensive in that sort of way. As was back then, it was set up in similar fashion between the various groups of Viet Cong throughout Vietnam or South Vietnam. Nowadays, this would be essentially the same type of circumstances. Other similar things were sporadically occurring throughout other defeated parts of the soon-to-be vanquished land, already brought officially under control in most areas, but not quite in as large of a fashion as of yet, as what was about to occur inside the Ann Arbor region was about to be. The uprising that had occurred by other armed Americans in the somewhat nearby Detroit area will have been a bit smaller, even in scope and scale, than would be what was about to occur in Ann Arbor. Although Detroit wouldn't be quite finished with such uprisings, and as that city was massive in terms of its total land size, its diversity of urban terrain and structures, and it also having many hiding underground who hadn't yet been ferreted out by the occupation troops throughout the city. The Chicoms and their allies thought that they'd already largely suppressed whatever capabilities the Americans had to resist in that sector, but they'd be proven wrong over time. Moreover, as far as the Ann Arbor AO was concerned, what was about to unfold here would be its first in terms of a series of massive armed uprisings among its remaining restive population of those remaining uncaptured or un-KIA'd Americans still managing to survive in hiding. The men had set out as quickly as possible the watch on Jacob's Arm now said it was 11:40 a.m. As for the all-terrain vehicles, there were less among his larger group since the distance was shorter than was the distance to the checkpoint. The checkpoint assault force was now traveling, requiring more all-terrain vehicles for faster and easier transport to their destination. In spite of this, the small amount of all-terrain vehicles in Jacob's group, with George as its leader, would still be enough to serve their primary purpose of carrying off whatever spoils could be gained from this assault. The men in this group had whatever remaining captured rocket-propelled grenade systems were left, and their ammo along with it, minus one system and 3 rockets for it, which went with the southbound checkpoint assault group, who were by now southeast from where the group was now going for the combat outpost. The rest carried some Molotovs, also a handful of Chicom and several North Korean grenades previously obtained as well. All in all, not much, but along with the myriad of small arms, including a recently captured Type 73 general-purpose machine gun, would add moderate weight overall to the assault. Of the scouts who discovered the combat outpost, of what they could ascertain, it wasn't a particularly large force occupying it, but it was a mechanized infantry company or smaller, perhaps a single platoon, or maybe even 2, if smaller than a full company. This, as sometimes companies did split themselves up in half, or even into 4 at the smallest, being 4 different platoons spread out among the outposts. It remained to be seen, but George was now fairly optimistic and hopeful that indeed they'd be able to perhaps get the drop, so to speak, on the outpost, as it were, especially now that groups of his men had attained some real field experience by this point as a result from all the previous instances of fighting over the past few days now of combat, plus continuous training during whatever downtime there had been intermittently. Yes, George had good reason to be optimistic, as there'd actually be 4,000 total Americans taking part throughout the entire region, all assaulting their own targets of opportunity. Of course, the total numbers involved in the entire undertaking were unbeknownst to him, as there was no way for any of the Americans to know who all would be taking part due to such poor communications and lack thereof overall when it came to instant forms of such. Be that as it were, the message and battle plan had indeed been spread far and wide since the early morning by multiple scouts from various armed American groups, starting with the groups nearer to the edges of eastern Ann Arbor area of operations near the positions of the Chicoms currently, where the PAP now sat as a virtual firewall, a sort of dragnet on Americans coming from Detroit in an attempt to escape recently begun counterinsurgency operations now happening there, spreading the message all the way to the far west of the AO, whereby any American groups encountered and found were thus informed, with nearly all their leaders agreeing to take part. This, despite none of them even fully aware of the other's participation, as no communications existed. However, as it related to communications and coordination, this was the very best that could conceivably be done, much less even hoped for. After all, without telecom, radio, internet, or even just the whole grid in general, it was back to the 1800s era in terms of the conditions faced. The men, including Jacob, all steadied their nerves. Jacob was still tired and recovering from the raid earlier undertaken from the night before into the early morning hours prior to now, and was doing his best to stay alert. He had drank some instant coffee to snap into action back at the campsite prior to leaving, but this only mildly helped the drowsiness he currently suffered. Although worn out physically, soon as adrenaline would return, kicking back in to where he would fully be back in prime working fighting condition. He learned quite a bit from his first combat actions, as he learned about his QBZ-95 Chicom-made rifle quite intimately. He learned how it felt to live fire it and how to be somewhat effective with it. He also knew how high the stakes were, having had lost 18 out of the group's original 30 during that freshly recent operation. There was no time to mourn the losses of the deceased, only time to live in the moment. This war was unlike anything Jacob could ever have even imagined throughout his entire peacetime life up to this point. He burned with the rage of vowing to have revenge for his wife, son, and 2 daughters. Recalling this, he began to utilize those feelings to begin to melt away his grogginess as they got nearer to their objective, the Korean People's Army combat outpost, which was within 500 meters of their current location. George had told the group to park their ATVs, of those who'd rode in upon such, and to begin to camouflage them with pine branches brought along upon the backs of them, along with weaponry and some fuel in the form of one of the 4 recently filled up 5-gallon gas cans. The slow-moving all-terrain vehicles, having driven in at a steady 5 miles an hour for noise discipline purposes, were thus now parked and carefully covered in the primitive camouflage which helped to shield them from infrared optics. Their all-terrain vehicles also had been carefully moved into patches of dense undergrowth wherever such areas of large amounts of foliage had been found, somewhat close to the wood line itself. George, satisfied upon seeing this completed, proceeded to consult his scouts who'd originally discovered the KPA outpost, and began to listen to them describe what all they'd seen there, of which they were even able to see, and then walked with George to the very edges of the woodline as they then lay down in the prone position before gazing off through binoculars at the farm, which itself had been somewhat fortified into a basic combat outpost, largely with sandbag positions, some concertina wire on the perimeter, and lots of foxholes and dug-in trench-like positions. The farm had a barn in quintessential red-colored paint and a farmhouse. It lay in a gently rolling hilly field, around which were patchy wooded areas surrounding it on all sides, including the edge of the forest in which the Americans were currently sitting, with a road winding between the KPA's outpost and a few other farms fairly close by to theirs. George could see that there were armor personnel carriers and a few infantry fighting vehicles as well, in the form of VTT-323s, which were essentially North Korean locally manufactured copies of Chicom Type 63 APCs, along with BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles having been acquired from the USSR during the Cold War. These vehicles essentially formed the backbone of many of North Korea's mechanized infantry formations. Of what could be ascertained, there were 8 total vehicles present, 6 armor personnel carriers and 2 infantry fighting vehicles. So, it was 2 platoons, comprised of 8 squads and their vehicles, 4 per platoon. This was a great thing, as that meant that if it was an entire company's combat outpost, that the other 2 platoons were gone out on patrol or gone in another combat outpost altogether. If it was part of a split-up company that was manning a few different combat outposts, that is. George, satisfied, now crawled back to the others before standing up once he was deeper into the woodline. Everyone, listen up. I'm going to give you all the rundown. There's 2 platoons worth of KPA troops inside that outpost. They're mechanized infantry, so they'll put up a tough fight. Fortunately for us, we outnumber them just a little bit, but still, they're more than a match for us. Even so, as their vehicles and equipment give them ample ability to fend us off. We still outnumber them. Those guys we fought way early in the morning earlier today were part of a scouting element. These guys have far better weaponry. We have the element of surprise, though. And these KPA forces aren't as well equipped or as capable overall as the Chinese forces are. Even so, they're still going to be tough to overcome for us. However, we do have some RPGs, and believe me, they gonna see some use today. I want my RPG guys to fall in, where there will be one group of 25 men per RPG guy. We are going to attack in 4 prongs, basically in 4 makeshift platoons. I want you all to fall in now. 24 men per RPG guy. That makes 25 men groups apiece out of our 100 men. It doesn't matter what order, just fall in. That'll be the platoons. Fall in now, barked George. The men all obeyed and weren't picky about it, falling in upon each of the 4 different RPG guys, making the 25-man ad hoc platoons. Doing so fairly quickly and fairly orderly, taking initiative to each do their part to make the plan come into full fruition to the best of all their God-given abilities. It was now several minutes until noon. George hoped in his own mind, that Tony and his group would be all right, being that they only had one guy with an RPG with only 3 rockets for it. His group had the lion's share of his overall armed group's very few RPGs having been acquired throughout the invasion up until that point. RPGs at this stage in the game, even so early in what would be an invasion transitioning into a very long occupation, were like solid gold bullion by this juncture. By far, for now, the most heavy-hitting of the group's equipped arms were the handful of these light anti-tank rockets, minus perhaps, maybe, the few light and general-purpose machine guns thus far acquired from the enemy as well. Grenades and Molotovs could also do the job, and some of the fuel seized earlier had been used to create a dozen new Molotovs in addition to whatever others George's men already had left until this point. The group being now arrayed into 4 subgroups or makeshift platoons, were crouched low near the ground or lay in the prone position entirely, awaiting further instructions. Jacob stayed with George, who was a veteran and the overall group leader. This because he'd already seen George in action, fight viciously during the early morning mission hours ago. He figured that with the tactical knowledge George possessed, he could learn more from him than most of the others, as well as having a feeling of relative safety alongside of George due to all the aforementioned attributes and qualities. George knew what he was doing for the most part, which gave Jacob confidence that he too could at least have a chance, even though George's one and main flaw was pushing the envelope way too far, as had been witnessed earlier. Realistically, however, many would perish conducting this mission. Moreover, it would in some ways be worse than what had occurred in the morning. But what would be the saving grace would be the blessing of God upon them, in the form of other armed Americans from another group who would end up assaulting the same area. Although no one in George's armed group knew of any other such groups operating close by, this indeed would be a blessing upon them showing up to take the pressure off of them, eventually leading to the total enveloping of the KPA's 2 platoons presently occupying this combat outpost. Not that George and his group didn't have what it took to beat the smaller group of KPA troops. It was that these KPA troops simply had very good positions within their combat outpost, along with very deadly vehicles. Just the weaponry in general overall being in the favor of the KPA troops here. George, however, was undeterred and gave the hand signals to get into the prone position and crawl to all of the men present, after already having had the men spread out some more prior to jumping off for the operation. This being generally a precautionary measure of protection against blasting munitions that could possibly be flying to destroy clusters of different men. This being in order to minimize casualties while incurring attack from any such weaponry. Fairly large were the 73mm cannons aboard the 2 IFVs, alongside which was the 7.62 by 54mm coax machine guns, which could lay waste to groups of men close together, thus causing George to spread his forces out upon being aware of the present arms at the KPA's disposal on the outpost. They'd be assaulting not in wedge formations initially, but with the 2 platoons on each of the 2 outer edges, spreading out into L-shaped formations, with the 2 middle platoons having 2 staggered columns per platoon, but heavily spaced out. There was a methodology to these tactics, as there would be a total of 4 staggered columns in the middle between the 2 middle platoons to be able to minimize casualties by not having all the men in front abreast all at the same time, along with the L formations on the ends, thereby eliminating the possibility of a quick turkey shoot should something go wrong if discovery of the sneaking men were to occur. Only the L formations on each end would be 1 column moving ahead to flank each side of the KPA's outpost, with the other part of the L shape moving as a single line facing the outpost along with the 2 middle platoons, as the opposite side columns were to flank it on either side, all occurring as the L formations took each edge of the outpost. The forces in the middle would move up in their staggered formations while staying low, totaling 4 between the 2 middle platoons. Upon reaching the combat outpost, would file into it, with each column then finally becoming wedge formations, as all the men left, provided they made it there safely, would then file into it and form up into attacking wedges upon entry of the outpost. In theory, at least, this was the plan, if it were to work without any major issues or mishaps. This would likely not be the case, as they had to maintain stealth to even getting close enough to make this feasible. George had put all his eggs into this particular tactical assault plan. It was thus far beginning to work out, as the two end platoons on each end of the 4 total such groupings spread out and into their L shapes. The middle platoons spread out and filing out of the wood line in their staggered column formations, all began to creep towards the outpost. So far, so good, as the men all crawled forward, in the prone position and proceeding through the tall grasses, all now camouflaged within them. Fortunately, all the men wore everything from real tree camouflaging to old varying types of different military camouflage schemes, which also helped within this current instance. However, some of the men, like Jacob, not owning anything like that, instead wore a dark green shirt that had been given to him along with jeans that had been spray painted with several types of green and brown spray paint colors and splotches. He had his QBZ-95 at the ready, along with his 4 magazines, all fully loaded with 5.8 by 42 millimeter ammunition. Also, he was equipped with a few Chicom grenades, as he'd been entrusted with using such after having made it out alive from his first combat experience. His jean pockets being deep enough for the magazines were full, 2 in one pocket, 1 in the other, along with one of the 2 grenades currently in his custody, with the last magazine he had within the rifle itself, fully locked and loaded. The other grenade of the 2 he had was clipped into his back pocket with the spoon of the grenade tucked into it. The men all made their way across the field, moving its total 500-meter length at a gruelingly slow pace, taking multiple minutes to cross. They had no other choices, as all of the approaches to the combat outpost were through open fields, except in the few rare spots between the several farms on the road, where there were wooded patches, although these were on opposite sides of the approach. The forest from which the 100-man American force had departed, with their several all-terrain vehicles therein, now sat behind them. These all-terrain vehicles were to be loaded down with any and all supplies taken from the hopefully soon-to-be defeated KPA forces. Though unaware, as no communications existed on the American side of things, American forces elsewhere throughout the whole greater AO of the Ann Arbor region had already begun their assaults, largely on other KPA and also what few PAP forces remained within other areas of the AO, while most had been on the eastern boundary line of it, trying to catch fleeing Americans from Detroit's currently now crushed uprisings. By now, after the clock had struck noon while the men had been crawling through the field, the coalition's forces throughout the rest of the AO, which largely were KPA forces, were all over the radios calling in their sustained defense against attacks upon their positions. The Forward Operating Bases Joint Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, where the joint command of the 3 different brigades occupying the whole Ann Arbor area of operations were receiving these calls on the radio, and were beginning to attempt to coordinate counterstrikes from any available artillery and or air support that could respond in good timing. This occurring as the calls came in. It then became apparent that this was an AO-wide operation. The 3 brigadier generals, one being of the KPA forces in the AO, and the two others of the PAP forces of the AO, who stayed in the local FOB's operations center, were baffled that there were so many attacks in so many parts of the AO, mostly upon the KPA troops who were left to hold down the large portions of the AO, while the PAP forces were busy guarding its easternmost perimeter. These leaders now were furious at this development. They demanded that any currently available air power close by that could be mustered immediately be sent into the AO to conduct airstrikes right away, in addition to the artillery that was being provided by some of the PLA's artillery batteries just outside the Ann Arbor AO, who were tasked with supporting the PAP and KPA, as well as other local areas of operation and associated forces within their howitzers' ranges. Even armed drones would be utilized, as well as available Chicom Hilo gunships in the form of the lighter Z-19 recon/attack helicopters from one of the PLA's aviation units stationed now in the Lansing area of operations. While not quite as heavy as the Z-10 attack helicopters, these lighter reconnaissance attack helicopters still packed a hell of a punch, able to deliver 8 Heilianjiang 08 anti-tank missiles from its pods, with 2 pylons for either gun or rocket pods. Very fast and very maneuverable, with an excellent millimeter wave radar to detect enemy targets. These lighter helicopters could make their way relatively quickly to the Ann Arbor AO upon taking off from Lansing, but they wouldn't be fully combat loaded and ready for their mission for nearly 40 more minutes after having been called in for assistance. For now, mostly the artillery would be the first responders, along with a squadron of Nanchang Q-5 ground attack jets, which were the nearest available and fairly quick to equip air assets. They were being scrambled to respond as quickly as would be possible from their area upon the mega FOB at the Detroit International Airport. With all of that assistance now en route, the KPA troops holding their zones within the Ann Arbor AO should be in decent enough shape to be able to repel the American assaults. However, the longer the reports continued coming in, the angrier the command and their staff officers on the Ann Arbor FOB became, as they continued hearing of more and more different outposts and checkpoints, even patrols, all now under assault. The Ministry for State Security, or the MSS, was also present in the talk, alongside the Chicom PAP paramilitary command elements of the 2 brigades headquarters battalions, acting as the intelligence liaison between the regular military and paramilitary of China, along with China's also foreign allies. Their mission of intelligence was important in Ann Arbor, as the combat forces occupying the area currently had no built-in intelligence forces within their 3 combat brigades themselves. As for the men of George's armed group, things were somewhat calm in their particular area, as the whole AO was a 40 by 40 mile block worth of territory. But although off to a sporadic start, the fighting would pick up as the contribution of 4,000 armed Americans belonging to all of the various armed groups taking part would definitely be doing some damage. As many such armed groups who'd been beaten and routed into hiding currently were now returning and beginning to rise up, even all nearly at the same time, after having had acquired vital, drastically needed time to regroup themselves after having been beaten so viciously at the beginning of the invasion. Now was the birth of the partisans throughout the area of Ann Arbor, all doing their first actions and activities as such forces, fighting the occupying powers of the victorious foreign coalition forces. The Americans were down and defeated, but not totally gone. Not by a long shot. The nation itself, officially, was on the brink of total defeat via being militarily vanquished and gone as a nation, as a sort of political entity on a map. Although it was not totally over with in terms of actual armed resistance was concerned. It would be these initial operations that would obtain drastically needed arms and munitions, as well as other supplies that would add weight to their overall abilities to even continue to wage war against the foreign occupation forces. The group led by George, the current forces presently around this outpost assault of 100 men in their 4 platoons, were now nearing the edges of the combat outpost perimeter itself, nearly 100 meters away. Thus far, miraculously not yet spotted, largely due in part to the 3 to 4 foot tall grasses having been in the field they crossed, sea wire was now in plain view through areas of the grass as it swayed in the breeze, along with North Koreans carrying Type 58 rifles, which essentially were AKM clones for all intents and purposes. These troops walking beats and patrols along the perimeter, behind the wire, and also within trenches in some cases. There were a few machine gun nests with 2 troops in each, 1 gunner with 1 spotter/assistant gunner for feeding the bandoliers and any related drum changes of such, or even barrel changes, in addition to the aforementioned duties, should said barrels become too hot from heavy use. These were heavy machine guns of the 12.7 millimeter variety, with one even bigger, 1 KPVT 14.5 millimeter machine gun, which faced the opposite direction, facing the road that passed in between the combat outposts farm and the others across the road from it. That would be an outstanding score if George and the others could somehow make off with it. It would serve as a highly lethal anti-materiel machine gun against helicopters and lighter armored vehicles. That machine gun was quite similar in role to the 12.7 millimeter, but with a bit more bite to it. George carried his recent prize of the Type 73 machine gun, having had taken it earlier with its bandolier of some remaining 155 rounds left remaining in it. Upon it having had been unpinned and taken by Tony, from one of the disabled UAZ-469s earlier in the morning upon fighting the North Korean recon element. He relished in the idea of being able to use it, along with the few captured Chicom light machine guns presently dispersed among his men, taken prior off of deceased PAP forces in earlier encounters, to be able to adequately mow down these KPA troops, who for their part, by now, as KPA forces, received news via radio of all the goings-on throughout the AO, being told to be on high alert for imminent potential assault from Americans. Indeed, these North Korean troops watched out in all directions before it finally occurred. Americans near the perimeter now opened fire with rifles of all types, both captured and previously owned prior to the war, along with the light machine guns and the Type 73 machine gun, which was presently in the hands of George, all while others worked on clipping the concertina wire to be able to breach the perimeter for the purpose of quickly storming the outpost as per the original assault plan. The raging firefight underway now was accompanied by the RPG men firing their rockets first at the highest priority targets, the two BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles, as these vehicles had the most lethal weapons that could obliterate the men within Georgia's now attacking group. Other men were busy cutting the sea wire while under heavy fire from the KPA forces within the outpost, who let their rifles and machine guns rip against some of the now spotted attackers. The two platoons of KPA troops numbered about 75 men, and were already beginning to lose troops, having been ambushed in total surprise, as George opening fire personally was the signal to get the assault underway, due to not having been spotted by the North Korean troops before he even did so. Jacob, now fully alert and back to his prior disposition as he had undergone earlier in the morning, was now back at his combat alertness. He aimed while in the prone position at the moving small targets presenting themselves through the tall grasses, barely visible, namely the heads of KPA troops running around in some of the trenches that were hardly able to be seen, or those who dropped immediately into the prone position, who had just been walking above the ground outside the trenches near their vehicles when the assault began. There were KPA troops who were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, who were thereby machine gunned where they sat, which was what set off the entire thing. These being the first KIAs inflicted by George and some of his compatriots. Others were being smacked by rounds as they splashed now all over the farm, ripping into the barn, farmhouse, and splashing throughout the grounds as a whole. One armor personnel carrier now started rolling out of the open barn doors. The barn having been utilized as a sort of maintenance area for the combat outpost, wherein basic vehicle maintenance could be conducted, as the barn offered a sort of garage-like area for such things. As the armor personnel carrier rolled outwards just a bit, it was quickly hit by an RPG rocket into its front left side, which blasted off its front engine flap, which actually landed on a then running KPA soldier who was running into action as the firefight was beginning, injuring him badly, landing on his helmet and then onto his back as he then fell down with it, instantly breaking his spine, thus paralyzing him instantly. The vehicle, now barely protruding from the outside of the barn, was now a smoking hulk of metal sitting there, with plumes of black smoke billowing out of its engine block, with the driver and gunner, now of course both deceased from the RPG's hit. All of the aforementioned, from the time the shooting began to the APC being destroyed as it rolled out of the barn, all happened within the first 5 minutes alone. In very short timing, all of these events transpired, and it grew ever more intense as the initial surprise now began wearing off. This, as the KPA troops struggled to regain the initiative on the defense, being that they'd been knocked back onto their heels, as the saying went, and thus put into the defensive, as they'd lost 10 of their men within the first 5 minutes, along with about 20 injured, ranging from minimally so to severely so. It got worse, though, on the American side, as the 2 BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles were still now active and firing their 73mm cannons and coax machine guns at the Americans. But one was soon destroyed by the RPG man on the left L formation, being on the flanking column of the L shape facing in towards the outpost, as it now began rising up with all of its men out of the prone position while beginning to run towards the right. This, as with the right L formation rising up and running towards the left of the combat outpost, all occurring along with all of the remaining Americans of Georgia's forces now entering the combat outpost through the carefully created holes they'd managed to clip in the concertina wire fencing in the center, crawling in to attempt to stay underneath the fire now being levied against them, only raising up when necessary to obtain and eliminate any viable enemy targets. Some of the men, while raising up to fire or bound to other cover, were instantly gunned down, peppered by machine gun and or rifle ammunition, ripping through and blowing bloody pieces out of their bodies, leaving them to bleed out onto the dirty soil of the farm's innermost grounds. Just then, a 73mm shell crashed into the ground beyond the now clipped fencing and blasted several men's body parts into the air where they'd been laying in the prone for safety, causing George to yell as loud as he could to take out the IFV in a rage while uttering a string of cursing. The nearest RPG men, 2 of them from the middle 2 platoons, were doing their best to make it happen, while trying to be as careful as was feasible, thereby not getting their asses blown off the literal map by these vicious weapons aboard the IFV itself. All of the KPA's weapons on the outpost now blared in all directions, making a major effort to attempt to stem the proverbial tide of infiltrators who have just now gained entry upon their outpost. Very similar were instances of the same having had occurred during the Vietnam War to certain American fire bases that had been attacked by VC and NVA elements. Here, too, was history rhyming with such similar past occurrences. The remaining 5 of the 6 total armored personnel carriers were focused now on the 2 different L formations, attacking the left and right corners and sides, respectively, of the overall combat outpost, while the 1 remaining BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle was focused on the 2 platoons attacking in the center. The KPA forces figured they would hold on and fend off the assault until help arrived in the form of either artillery, air, attack helos, or drone strikes, or perhaps a combo of the aforementioned. However, now merely 14 minutes into the fight, just having called into the radio that they were being assaulted, and the Americans' coordinates in order to hit them, it would be largely too late, as the Americans knew that once upon entering the combat outpost itself, it would be a danger close strike upon them and would not likely occur due to the friendly fire concerns against hitting the KPA troops themselves. Meanwhile, Jacob was taking well-aimed, steady shots. He did manage to make 1 confirmed KIA upon smacking a KPA soldier through his helmet, annihilating him instantly. He had to roll over a few times to his left after doing so, this being done as rounds splashed all over by a torrent of return fire being levied against him, which smacked into the ground where he'd just taken the lethal shots from as he rolled away safely. The two of which that hit into the KPA soldier's helmet. He remembered to stay moving while in combat, as to stay still for too long would get him eliminated. He looked for another target of opportunity, and finding none for the time being, also knowing he had to stay with the others, got up and bounded, following a few others within the original staggered formations, already now making entry through all the holes that had been clipped in the C-wire fencing. Americans, while bounding, though some made it, some didn't, were getting inside now, little by little, now jumping into the different trenches and foxholes, as well as some simply just dropping into the prone position behind some of the sandbags they ran up on, and kept up the pressure on the KPA soldiers within the combat outpost. Here and there, some of the men of George's group were being smacked into their heads by rounds, blowing out gory chunks of bone and tissue. Also, some were hit in their limbs and chests. Those who wore plate carriers or even full-on body armor fared immensely better than those who did not, who by their lack of protection often sustained life-threatening wounds if they weren't killed outright. Despite the initial successes thus far up to this point, the fight wasn't an easy one by any stretch, and roughly 45 Americans had already thus been eliminated. Some of these KIAs were the mortally wounded who just couldn't be saved amid the current fighting, leading to them passing on from their deadly wounds from bleeding out and the shock. The RPG men, two of which part of the Center 2 attacking American platoons, made it to one of the trenches, which, with several KPA troops in it at the time, had just been captured by 10 other Americans who had previously jumped down into it along with the RPG operating men following suit. These men, fighting hand-to-hand and with rifle butts, bayonets, or knives, and close-quarters use of small arms, including even one man drawing a .40 caliber pistol and emptying 10 rounds into a single KPA soldier, managed to secure the trench within just under 2 short minutes of the fighting within the trench itself, concluding between the said KPA troops and American men. The 2 RPG men then loaded anti-tank rockets, and both fired now from the somewhat relative safety of the low-laying trenches up towards the last BMP-1, hitting it with 2 rockets, which, blasting through and killing all inside, left it as a disabled, smoking hulk of metal with which holes wherein the rockets impacted through it left significant visible battle damage. Now all that was left were the remaining armored personnel carriers, as the 2 RPG men inside the trench aimed for whichever they could feasibly find left at the proper angles. Just then, one of the men was instantly shot in the head, a piece of bone, flesh, and brain matter splattering on another American, who turned and shot the KPA soldier within 1 second of him hitting one of the 2 RPG men, and was now hit by the round sent sailing into him from the North Korean, as far as it related to the now dead RPG man. The American hit the KPA soldier responsible with rapidly well-aimed shots, who was in the prone position, aiming at their trench, having hit him in his head with a burst of 7.62 from his captured Type 58 rifle, returning upon the KPA soldier what he'd just done to the RPG man that he'd hit. He then vomited profusely upon fully realizing what had landed upon him in the sense of the gore. Once coming out of the proverbial mental focus or quote-unquote zone, as it were, of combat temporarily, only then to return to such upon others around him yelling at him to pick up the RPG and shoot that damn BMP-1 that remained, to assist the other remaining RPG man with the very same task. He then did so, as both then fired in unison, upon aiming at its undercarriage area that could be seen now from within the trench, some 75 meters away. Both managed to score hits, and thus destroyed the vehicle, leaving it smoking, much like its previous fellow infantry fighting vehicle just moments earlier. Jacob was letting loose with full auto fire from his QBZ-95, having had flipped the selector switch from auto to semi-auto. His fire ripped upon a close-by sandbagged machine gun nest, which encased one of the 12.7 millimeter machine guns, which currently faced away from Jacob, aimed out to the left of the combat outpost, currently was now being fired at the remaining surviving men of the closing L formation that on that side of the outpost, that had attacked that side of the outpost. Jacobs and the others' weapons firing caused the two in that particular machine gun nest, the gunner and assistant gunner, to currently keep their heads down, which took a little bit of the pressure off of the remains of the closing L formation of Americans on that side, which actually bought them time enough to raise up and bound in closer in somewhat near range towards the compound on that side. They clipped the concertina wire on their side of the compound that they flanked, as their one RPG man of their platoon's closing L on that part of the formation that flanked the outpost was doing well with wiping out some of the armor personnel carriers that had been facing that side, of which there were 3 there on that side. In all of the North Korean vehicles, there were only the gunners and drivers, which left all of the rest having been the dismounts, which were now being fought on foot. By this point, the closing L on the right edge of the assault took out the remaining 2 armor personnel carriers on their side, while the one having left the barn and, of course, 2 BMP-1s were already destroyed by the 2 RPG men of the middle 2 platoons that had come up through the center. This was a great triumph, but the battle wasn't quite over, as there were still a little over half of the original 75 KPA troops remaining, some 39 left. They were still holding the machine gun nests, but Jacob now tossed one of his 2 grenades at the nest that he was opening fire upon, facing his left, while the KPA troops took cover below the sandbag walls of their machine gun position. There then came a surge of dirt and smoke, and a severed arm, even, with 2 bodies of the gunner and assistant gunner quickly flopping up and down, just high enough that they could barely be seen above the sandbag wall of their machine gun nest, as they went up fast and fell to the ground within a split second. These being their badly maimed, now deceased corpses. Jacob's grenade attack saved the day for the men of the closing L formation coming in on the left side, as the nest had been the last major obstacle they faced of their advance in from the left flank. All that now remained were some scattered North Korean soldiers either in foxholes or running, bounding and covering from spot to spot within that specific area of the outpost. Some KPA troops fired out the windows of the farmhouse, both on the first and second floors, but were then hit finally with an RPG anti-personnel rocket loaded up by one of the surviving RPG men of the 2 center platoons. The other man who had picked up the other RPG from the original deceased RPG man was now gathering the few remaining rockets from the original deceased RPG operator who'd been hit in the head. He too now took fire against the home, sending in an anti-tank round, then the last round, which they had being an anti-personnel RPG round. Both crashed into the home's second floor, blasting massive holes into its walls, totally gutting it, its roof now sagging, but revealing the sandbagged walls inside within its top floor but below the windows, which lay behind the home's walls. Many of these sandbags, now blown out with the house's front wall, were also partially blown back into it as well. On the first floor, the other RPG operator fired his last rocket at the first floor's front wall and blasted it out, which made the whole house now begin to sag quite a bit, before then slowly rocking and leaning forward before finally collapsing in one swift motion, leaving only the stone chimney still standing, as the wooden home simply couldn't withstand its support boards and virtually whole front wall on both floors being entirely blown out, causing it to collapse to the ground. The KPA forces present kept their radios in the farmhouse, aside from the ones that were mounted inside of their vehicles. Along with this, the home originally was where the two lieutenants and platoon sergeants of the two platoons maintained their quarters and miniature tactical operations center, and now it was annihilated within the collapsed structure. KPA troops continued shooting in an atmosphere of increasing desperation to repel the vicious American assault throughout the now penetrated and compromised combat outpost, including using their KPVT 14.5 millimeter heavy machine gun, which needed badly to be knocked out, as it had just been turned to fire against the Americans from where they attacked from. The KPA troops remaining now bounded and covered to and fro, darting from various cover and concealment positions to others, or dropped quickly into the prone position wherever no such cover and concealment positions existed, where they instead figured they'd get down where they stopped at before continuing to open fire. Originally, the KPVT heavy machine gun was aimed towards the road that passed in between this and the few other farms that lay across the road from it, as a means of covering the road adequately with heavy firepower. The two nests of the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns were now totally taken out of commission, but the Americans had by now lost many of their men in this assault, with now 65 KIAs on their side, and additionally more wounded besides just the merely deceased. Even George himself took 2 hits, one in the right side above his hip, barely missing any major organs or arteries, plus a nasty hit to his shoulder, ripping out a chunk of muscle tissue, skin, and pieces of bone. He was laying on the ground, hollering and cursing in severe, massive pain. 2 others had run to him by this point, while yelling to Jacob and several others around him to cover them as they tended to George medically. Some men brought primitive first aid supplies, which would end up saving George's life as he lay there bleeding out. This due to preventing nasty infections from setting into the wounds and preventing any more blood loss by packing the wounds fairly well. The wounds themselves would have only been life-threatening had nobody actually been able to get to him in time. While the attack now began to bog down, help began arriving, other Americans who were in the area and informed of the battle plans earlier made it finally to the area, originally wanting themselves to hit this combat outpost by themselves for the same reasons as George's group. Even so, they made it about 30 minutes too late beyond the original noontime timetable. But all in all, even though the Americans here responded in a somewhat lackluster fashion, they were doing basically what the Tet-Offensive managed to do itself, tying down groups of occupation forces and forcing them into battles not on their own terms, in the sense of the occupation's terms. The other Americans now showing up were a blessing, as there now came some 80 of them running across the road while firing their weapons. Able to do so now that the KPVT machine gun had been turned away from the road, as the KPA began not expecting anyone to attack from there, as they were busy focusing on George's group from the three sides they hit upon. Besides, also needing to finish off whatever remained of the assaulting Americans of George's group, now badly mauled by the encounter with the two KPA mechanized infantry platoons. The other 80 Americans, though smaller than the original assaulting 100 of George's group, were now plenty in terms of numbers to be able to finish off the remains of the North Korean garrison of this combat outpost. 35 Americans of George's overall group now remained out of the original 100. There were 17 of those remaining 35 who were wounded. Fortunately, none of which were wounded in action too severely and were ambulatory, minus, of course, George. But the fighting continued. Jacob kept firing to support the men now currently patching up George, offering them covering fire as they did so. The men of the Americans approaching laid down their fire upon the KPVT nest at the entryway of the combat outpost to watch its gateway into the driveway, guarding originally entry into the farm turned mini installation. The KPVT, now taking fire from the rear of its crew, having now turned it, caused its two operators to start turning it back around again, which led to both being dispatched in a hail of rounds. Now the last KPA troops left remaining formed into two wedges of 8 men each and bounded and covered towards the last of the Americans of George's men who were left, because they were attempting a breakout. These North Koreans figured their only chance now was to fight their way out of the weakest area of now thinned out Americans, which was largely the greatly diminished numbers of George's group that remained. "Fire! Hit those SOBs! Don't let them get away!" yelled one of George's remaining men, with the others yelling their own versions of a similar message. All the remaining Americans put up their best fight possible as the KPA troops stopped to fire, while the others of the opposite wedge bounded forward towards the edge held by the Americans of George's group, which was currently occupied by the remains of the two middle platoons of George's men. The edges of the two platoons, who came as a closing L as the two closing L formations, hardly had even any of their men left remaining at all. But they too had made it into the combat outpost even so. Jacob loaded another magazine, his last, and fired back at KPA troops, now firing upon the trench he was now currently taking cover in and shooting out of. He smacked a KPA soldier on automatic fire, cutting up his left leg into his stomach, then which hitting his armor, and then his right shoulder finally, as the muzzle climb forced his rifle in an upward arc, generally to the left, causing the now hit KPA soldier to fall forward on his face as he was in the middle of bounding ahead. The KPA wedge, now behind cover, shooting behind the protection of a ditch they were laying in the prone in currently, were assaulted by an American deploying a grenade, with another also tossing a Molotov that he just lit at them from 30 meters away, a bit to the front right side of the KPA position in that ditch. There came a smash and fire rising up slightly, with painful screaming, as well as a blast shortly thereafter, throwing dirt, debris, and smoke up into the air with its concussive blast wave. Shrapnel from, along with the blast wave of the grenade itself, cut down most of the 8 who were covering the men who were just then taking their turn bounding ahead, who now stopped to take cover in the prone once Jacob lit one of them up quite badly with his arc of fire. Multiple 5.8 by 42 millimeter rounds having smacked into the soldier's chest and head, which had caused the rest of the men in that wedge to take cover. It was almost over now, as Jacob threw his final single remaining hand grenade of the original 2 he had carried into the operation, throwing it quickly at the KPA troops now taking cover. In so doing, by tossing his last grenade, he then immediately started spraying his rifle into the air, aiming just above the men who had dropped to the prone. He couldn't hit them from where he was as they were in the prone, but he could make them stay down just long enough for his just then tossed grenade to erupt, finishing them all off. Which it did, upon rocking the ground with its powerful thud noise being relatively close upon detonation. Jacob, after this, had badly ringing ears and could barely hear anything at all. Such was the case with all of the men present who remained alive at the end of the cessation of hostilities. The rest of the men who were unwounded, which wasn't very many, got up to quickly sweep the farm in order to clear it, to ensure that no enemies remained which could still pose a threat, whilst resources were then to be gathered just prior to then rapidly fleeing the area in haste. Upon the other Americans from the new group entering, they too joined in with the clearing operation. With George wounded, another led the group's leader to George, who himself could still speak to him. The 2 men spoke, and it was agreed upon to split up the findings at the outpost. All the supplies, usable weapons, and ammunition, and any, if at all, fuel that remained, as well as ancillary supplies too, were to be divvied up among the two groups. 4 of George's men, still unharmed, had ran off to grab the 4 all-terrain vehicles that they'd brought along with the rest of the group coming in on foot, to thereby bring them both forward to pick up George and also the heavier supplies taken. Of the ambulatory wounded who could still help, they grabbed ammo cans, grenades, and MREs and water that could be carried by them, even as they were somewhat wounded. Everyone grabbed all that they could carry, in general, carrying whatever they could, however they could. Even Jacob did his part by grabbing RPG rockets and a few new tubes themselves, which would be helpful for future operations, having had found them still shut in a box. Yet 2 more others went around collecting all the weapons of both the American dead and KPA dead as well. All of it was taken in terms of anything salvageable, including the KPVT heavy machine gun, allowing the other group to take the 2 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns. In exchange for George's men obtaining the KPVT heavy machine gun, which was a good deal overall for both groups, and a massive boost to the firepower of George's group. Boxes of MREs, some bottled water cases, and grenade crates and rocket crates of the RPG types with the tubes were found inside the barn. Tools were taken as well, such as those used for basic vehicle maintenance, as well as hand tools like saws and hatchets. All the way around, it was a big score for all involved. The men hurriedly left before retaliatory strikes that had been called in would arrive in time, even though they had been called in minutes ago. It was no small blessing that with so many different assaults occurring in so many areas throughout the AO, this essentially meant that it took more time than normal to thus be able to coordinate all of the different counterstrikes and fire support for all of the different troops under attack currently in the field. Some forces held off well against the Americans attacking them, while some did not. Generally speaking, this was mostly the smaller groups of isolated KPA troops, often far-flung checkpoints and small combat outposts. Similar to instances of combat during the Vietnam conflict as it pertained to entire platoons, and sometimes even the more rare company-sized elements of Americans being wiped out completely, the KPA was experiencing similar in terms of such instances as what had now just occurred during the assaults resulting from the hastily thrown together attack by the overall 4,000 men-sized forces of the Americans carrying out all of these moderate-scale hit-and-run style uprisings throughout the AO. Completely and totally unexpected by the local coalition forces, but completely infuriating them as a result. Overall, these assaults lasted between 30 minutes on the shorter end of some places under attack, all the way up to 2 hours on the longest end. George's and the other group having had arrived, their tandem actions lasted merely 50 minutes total. From the time they started the shooting to the last men leaving with their final acquisitions in hand. The other group of Americans grabbed their their agreed upon spoils of the items and departed as well, back from whence they came, as the remaining forces of George's did the same, which now was very few remaining. They also quickly departed with all of their hard-won trophies as well. As they did, drones started to enter the area, now circling around, firing air-to-ground missiles at the retreating Americans of the other group, which hit the men of the other group as they fled off in the distance, no doubt eliminating some number of them as they tried to run to escape the area. Although they had the foresight and enough wisdom, tactically speaking, to spread out as they fled to minimize their casualties somewhat from any munitions, this as they bolted towards the other wood line off in the distance to the northeast of the now currently wiped out KPA combat outpost. In addition to the drone strikes, some 4 missiles launched at the fleeing group from such artillery now also began flying in and crashing throughout the farms and fields in the immediate area. As the artillery fire missions called in finally began to make their rounds against this specific area of the AO, as other areas under assault were given much higher priority, causing the strikes to come in a bit late against George's and the other group. The shells caused immense destruction wherever they struck. While they did so, the last remaining men alive from George's group, some now 34 of them, as one of the former 17 wounded coming out of the former number of being 35 original survivors, had finally succumbed to their wounds, bleeding out due to having lost too much blood already by that point, and thus falling out unconscious. No doubt they would soon be deceased. There was no way to save that man, as medical supplies brought along hadn't been sufficient in number or adequacy for certain levels of trauma and severity of said injuries, and he thus was left as the shells impacted throughout the area. One even landing and blasting 7 more men into literal pieces amid massive white and gray clouds of smoke surging up powerfully with dirt and debris, part of which was the deadly shrapnel of the shell itself. Many of those claimed by shells were slower but ambulatory wounded men who could still move on foot, although their degraded abilities to run made them far easier prey to the artillery strikes now landing their blows. Blows which left the field a now pockmarked, cratered wasteland, which had formerly been a cluster of farms and their associated fields. The drones that had carried out the missile strikes on the other group of Americans that had fled in the opposite direction now circled the area to direct the artillery fire into more precise strikes by relaying the coordinates of anyone found running, to thereby obtain a lead on where they were predicted to run towards, which didn't always work, but the stragglers were being picked off bit by bit, as another group of 5 more was hit by the enormous blast of yet another 152 millimeter shell impacting the ground. Now there were no more than 22 men left from the original 100 that George brought along initially for the assault. The men began to make it to the wood line and mounted up on their all-terrain vehicles, which were, for the time being, before doing so, well camouflaged from the circling drone's IR cameras. But now that the men departed upon their several ATVs, with all their weapons and most seriously wounded among them, there came then a volley of shells now crashing into the forest. However, the men had made it far enough back into the forest proper in the minutes it took for the PLA's howitzers to readjust their guns for the then fire at will command given by the FDC, or Fire Direction Control, over the PLA's local artillery batteries in the other close by areas of operation. These shells all began to smash the wood line to splintered, cratered bits, with the last 22 men escaping barely with their lives. Merely 170 meters in front of the blasts now occurring, right behind where they literally had just fled from. That was how close they were to being caught up by the artillery. Truly an unbelievably perilous situation, to be certain. The sheer cost of lives just to obtain more weaponry and supplies was unfathomable and stark and bleak. Even to wipe out merely 2 platoons of North Koreans who weren't even as combat effective overall as the Chicom forces were per capita, forced a level of attrition that would have to be somehow rectified, and the only way that could occur would be to merge with other armed groups of Americans wherever, whenever found, and wherever willing to do so. It had yet to be seen how well the other smaller group of 50 men did while dealing with the KPA checkpoints on the road further to the south of the campsite belonging to George's overall entire group. Those 50 having been led by Tony on a separate mission. It wouldn't be wrong for anyone to assume that they might have suffered a similar bleak fate to the abject mauling that just occurred to the bigger group of men that had gone after the outpost. Perhaps Tony's group possibly acquired some supplies also to put together with those taken by George's group from the outpost. Even George was moderately wounded himself, but he would survive, as was removed on time upon the all-terrain vehicle before the artillery and drones began striking the area. Moreover, the sound of helicopters could now also be heard. These were the PLA's Z-19 recon/light attack helicopters coming in from nearby Lansing, where the PLA had a company from one of its aviation battalions. These were freed up to assist the embattled KPA forces of North Koreans within the separate AO of Ann Arbor, as Lansing was an entirely different AO unto itself, were still needed and committed to blocking, this being due to the fact that the PAP forces assigned to the Ann Arbor AO itself were still needed and committed to blocking the easternmost borders of the AO to intercept any Americans fleeing from the failed, crushed uprisings that had just occurred recently in Detroit. Due to the fact that the PAP was blocking fleeing Americans from entering the Ann Arbor AO, This was now a strategic development, as blocking such from fleeing was to prevent them from joining those who just arisen within the Ann Arbor area itself to carry out such uprisings again in the future. It was now highly likely that the PAP would now be maintaining fairly large forces upon the lines bordering the Ann Arbor area of operations with the Detroit area of operations. Other AOs that bordered Detroit's as well would likely do very similar with their forces in addition to what was now being done in Ann Arbor. Aside from the attack helo gunships now responding, other KPA units in the area who had held off and repelled American assaults throughout other parts of the AO were being gathered for counter-assaults against any known areas where Americans had been spotted fleeing towards or within. In the city itself and surrounding suburbs predominantly, KPA forces were wrapping up their defensive operations against the Americans conducting their Tet-style offensive, now counterattacking them by trying to pursue their now fleeing American enemies, leading to desperate encounters on the side of the Americans, leading to many being mercilessly eliminated while they retreated from the KPA. Of the 4,000 armed Americans throughout the whole AO who partook in the overall offensive, only an estimated 1,500 survived. However, of those who escaped to fight on another day as partisans, most of whom managing to have acquired vital supplies and weapons, which indeed would guarantee the near to moderate term survival of those remaining in the fight for some time. This as the food, clean water, fuel, ammo, and even some specialty weaponry would ensure that those who obtained such gear, equipment, and provisions would be able to continue fighting and sustenance, allowing for their survival to continue. The food especially would in many cases be enough to get whole subgroupings of Americans through the winter months, more or less being the hardest time of year to find food out in the wild, in nature. Despite the success of most of the groups in obtaining and meeting their basic needs, including weaponry, not all of the groups made off so well. But the smaller groups who failed to achieve any real success in scoring vital items during the assault would be looked after by the larger and or more successful groups of Americans who would simply induct and amalgamate them into their groups for added manpower to make up for their horrible losses. Horrible attrition rates led to such outcomes even being necessary, as numbers would need to be upkept as much as was realistically even possible, as the combat occurring within this war chiseled away at their numbers. As it related to the Americans, it became a survival of the fittest situation, and a survival of the most blessed, including within the aforementioned description of fittest. What was being left was a shrinking cadre of highly now experienced men who learned the ropes quickly, or else they fell in battle. There were no such thing as do-overs, no second chances. All the men who committed themselves to the fight understood that they had to do it right the first time or not at all, as they wouldn't be left standing otherwise. Jacob, along with the other survivors, even George being carried back upon one of the ATVs along with all the loaded down weapons and supplies, made it back to the campsite alive. Fortunately for the men who'd been involved, due to the scope and scale of the entire assault occurring throughout the whole AO at relatively the same time, there were so many areas needing to be found, isolated, and thereby destroyed by the local coalition forces that realistically the occupying forces would need to draft an entire battle plan to do so, set up and allocate the logistics and specific forces to thereby commit to it, then execute a big operation. This would require at least several days to 1 or perhaps 2 weeks to draft even any sort of adequate counter-assault against the partisan elements, who just now began revealing themselves, along with now also conveying through their attacks that the Americans were indeed not totally defeated and done, finished within the Ann Arbor area, something that the occupation forces thought originally had been the case. Once day 3 of the overall invasion had struck, which in this specific sector meant that the first intended day of occupation duties was to begin, as they had met their initial invasion goals and seized control over the entire AO, with the initial invasion combat finally completed there. But the partisans now began to carry out their first acts of guerrilla warfare, having yet for it to fully unfold. These were the initial steps of what would indeed be a long-haul sort of back-and-forth battle, a war of sheer attrition. Enormously loud blasting sounds could now be heard, whereby the helicopter gunships earlier flying overhead had launched their anti-tank missile salvos, rockets from rocket pods, and in some cases their 12.7 millimeter gun pods, upon which were equipped, at Americans spotted on the ground by their millimeter wave radar systems. At least those who weren't well camouflaged by the forest and coniferous trees or other means of such subterfuge. Tony and the others came slowly, methodically, and cautiously limping back into their campsite before having rapidly camouflaged their all-terrain vehicles upon hurriedly unloading all their contents into the bunkers of the camp. They said little to nothing whatsoever at all to one another, as it appeared they'd seen pure hell, much like the larger group that hit the outpost. Very little of them returning alive. Fewer returning alive and actually in good shape, as of the original 50 men sent out to ambush the KPA checkpoints off to the south from the camp, only 19 returned. Of those, only 8 were unharmed physically, with the rest having sustained injuries of different types and varieties. All in all, of the 26 all-terrain vehicles taken by that 50-man group, only 17 returned, with the rest having been destroyed by enemies. Some with their drivers still piloting them, attempting to return, fleeing the hot zone. Tony made it, and was among the few men who were alive and unharmed at this point. But his face was pale, despite having had managed to succeed in returning with weapons of different types. The blasts occurring a moderate distance away were targeting a different group of Americans that had been found retreating from ambushing a KPA patrol somewhere else. This, of course, was unknown to George's group, which made them think that quite possibly the helos were after them in particular, and possibly maybe were attempting an intimidation tactic or perhaps somehow trying to smoke them out of hiding. This was extremely unsettling, but it caused the entire group to rapidly unpack their acquisitions and hide within their primitively built, dug-in bunker complex comprising their current campsite. Of course, they hid only upon first camouflaging their remaining all-terrain vehicles. Meanwhile, at the transit camp prison, many new prisoners were filtering in who'd just been captured throughout the Ann Arbor AO. This new influx came partially from the Americans just captured from their recent assault on the afternoon of day 3, but also those captured by the PAP forces of they who were trying to flee the Detroit AO to enter Ann Arbor's AO, thereby being apprehended by the PAP forces. It was time for June to be moved to general population of the camp, where she was to be housed until her final destination would be thereby decided and assigned. She never meant to aid her oppressors, and wasn't even aware that she even had, much less even how she had. She was inadvertently rewarded for her unknowingly cooperating with the MSS agent Liu Zhang. Liu, for his part, annotated such in his notes, which kept June from being totally brutalized at the hands of the PAP, who would have put a woman of her physique and shapely figure into sexual bondage, literally and figuratively, keeping her in a wooden dog box as such a slave, where she would live in such conditions, being broken down day and night. She instead was sent to a chicken coop-like structure, which was fenced in by rows of barbed wire held up by metal poles, with a double layer of concertina wiring at the bottom of the fenced-in coop-looking prisoner barracks. The fence had a chain-link gate to it, kept in place by 2 of the metal poles of the type that held up the fencing material, which was itself the only entry and exit into the yard which contained these particular prisoner barracks. As there existed many such fenced-in buildings, which all were uniform in their appearance. These buildings were where all the normal prisoners were kept, but assigned to particular blocks according to their categorization prior to and before transport away from the camp. This setup was very similar to the World War II era German Nazi concentration camps in terms of its outdoor layout. June was led between 2 rows of fences with prisoner blocks encapsulated within one on each side. Guards walked beats through these proverbial streets of the camp portion that was outdoors, which ran behind the concrete intake buildings in a sort of grid-like pattern through the prisoner block barracks. These blocks all sat behind the front modular concrete buildings which contained the intake cell houses of the modular concrete jail cells of which she'd just been moved from. The guards opened the gate to block number 15, which said such in English in its painted signage, along with also Mandarin characters. Guard towers were on the outermost perimeter fences of the entire massive facility, which comprised the transit prison camp on one side and the forward operating base of the local PAP and KPA forces on the other, which combined were both connected and now sat upon what recently once was the Ann Arbor Municipal Airport. There were only two buildings which sat as connection points between the forward operating base and the prison's camp fencing, which ran between the dual facility. One building being the dining facility along with its kitchen, which itself served food for both the troops but also the prisoners of the transit camp who had theirs brought out to them. The other building being the bordello, which itself sat in a hangar of the former airport, now turned dual-purpose coalition facility. She was led into Block 15 before being unshackled and let go before the guards dropped her cheap accommodations supplied earlier by them for her cooperation with Liu Zhong onto the ground beside her before leaving, closing the gate behind them as they left. She looked around, seeing other prisoners within the block walking around its yard. All in all, the yard was nothing but a quarter-acre worth of open ground, within which the large coop-looking building sat also inside of. She walked up to the small walk ramp of the stilted coop-looking building, carrying in with her her cigarette pack and cheap matches given with it, along with her cheap blanket and cheap pillow of the common variety, disposal variety given by the airlines. Upon entering through one of the building's two doors on each end of it, she could see other women, all laying down on the bunk boards, with each containing straw mattresses. Essentially, a long cloth that was 6 foot in width and 30 feet long, which wrapped around covering the straw. This as a long, simple mattress upon the bunk boards. There were 3 tiers of such bunk boards upon both sides of the central aisle of the coop-like structure. 90 women could fit inside this structure, as that was the planned capacity of each such building. There were whispers, and one woman walked up to June, handing her a half-liter tin bowl that resembled something like a dog food bowl, along with a plastic spoon, which was the appointed block captain of the Block 15, and was told to look after the other prisoners to enforce the rules and report any issues in the block, sort of like the capos in the old Nazi camps. She told June that the PAP held roll calls for the prisoners and often used prisoners for forced labor details, and that propaganda movies of the Chicoms were part of daily enforced activities, normally in the mornings for her block. Those not on work details were forced into one of the hangars on the facility to watch 1 hour of propaganda viewing daily. This was enforced by block, whereby there were 3 hangars on the camp dedicated for just this purpose. And each hour per day, a block would rotate through it for mandatory viewing sessions. Also, meals were brought to the block itself by the We to the Gur trustees along with their guards. While describing the forced labor often carried out, food prep was the best job to get because you could get more food that way. And there was a booming black market within the camp due to obtaining extra food and tobacco, even the more rare alcohol, as the North Korean troops on the FOB sometimes left empty soju bottles with still left some amounts of alcohol remaining within them in the trash cans behind the dining facility and kitchen building. Often with the We to the Gurs also imprisoned as trustees and additional slave labor for the occupation troops being willing to trade with the Americans currently incarcerated. June now began to sob because even though she listened, she kept thinking about all she'd already been through and the loss of her family being now permanently split up, as well as realizing she had been mentally hamstrung by the Chinese and realizing the torture that also was occurring at their hands after having seen the brutalized men in the room Liu had shown her. She herself took, personally, quite a literal shock in the realm of torture via cattle prod when she first entered the facility due to speaking out of turn. She began to sulk upon sitting upon the bottom bunk board. The straw of the mattress was uncomfortable, but much easier on her than was the concrete bench of her cell within the temporary intake cell house she had just left from. The block captain tried to console June, and even though talking wasn't technically allowed in the facility unless official business or being spoken to by the PAP guards, the women here often kept their voices low within the block building itself when conversating. The block captain, seeing June in her current state of distress, didn't want to bring up the final point of business, warning her of the summary executions and torture, which, of course, June was already aware of the latter of the two. As for the former, 2 prisoners pulled for the cleaning duties on the FOB side of the twin installation tried running off from the building they'd been assigned to mop and clean, and had been rapidly caught by PAP armed troops walking around casually on the FOB side, who, for their part, summarily shot both in the head for their attempt to run away. The only armed PAP troops on the prison camp side of the dual facility were those in the guard towers and the quick reaction force who were on standby for any potential uprisings and rioting amongst those imprisoned. However, the FOB side was a full-on military installation for the paramilitary PAP forces and the military of the KPA soldiers present, meaning escape from there was no easier, despite the fact that the gates in and out of the FOB side weren't as secure as those in and out of the prison side, because vehicles steadily drove in and out of it, making entry and exit easier, with no fences that opened and closed, simply just barriers with machine gun nests on either side, which could possibly be snuck past, say if one were to somehow manage to hide within an empty back of a leaving truck or similar. However, this would still be something the most well-trained and most physically fit could feasibly pull off, which itself meant that those trying to flee their work detail either simply didn't care anymore about life, figuring there was nothing to lose by trying, leading to their swift executions on spot once caught, or they just simply froze up like deer in the headlights upon hearing the first shots being fired at them, which led to the PAP troops reaching them and forcing them to kneel before doing them in finally. At this point, this early into matters as it related to the freshly erected, now 3-day-old modular camp and forward operating base, nobody had managed to do any such thing as it related to escape, apart from entering the facility and being processed for shipment to their more permanent camps or facilities. Escape was largely impossible, and once inside its wire, all hope was lost amongst the inmates locked up. End of part 23.